Dawn broke over the Philippine Sea in a haze of gray and orange. To the east of Samar Island, the U.S. escort carriers of Task Unit 7743, nicknamed Taffy 3, moved slowly across calm water, their decks crowded with Avengers and Wildcats being armed for ground strikes in support of the Leyte landings. Few aboard expected a sea battle that morning. They were lightly armed, built for air support, not for surface combat. The destroyer USS Johnston, hull number DD-557, cut a thin white wake on the screen's northern edge. Her captain, Commander Ernest E. had been at general quarters since before sunrise, the ship's crew already at their stations, their 5-inch guns trained seaward against a horizon that seemed empty. At 6:47, radar operators aboard the carrier Fanshawe Bay saw new returns, large, fast-moving blips closing from the northwest. Within minutes, lookouts confirmed the unthinkable, masts and pagoda superstructures piercing the morning mist. The Imperial Japanese Navy's center force, 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers, was bearing down at high speed. Among them was Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. Against this armada, Taffy 3 possessed 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. It was not a battle formation, but a convoy defense group. No one had planned for direct confrontation. Evans's orders were clear: screen the carriers and protect them during flight operations. But radar tracks told their own story. The Japanese were within gunnery range of the carriers in less than half an hour. Radio chatter filled the bridge, enemy surface force closing fast. Shell splashes near White Plains. The horizon erupted in orange flashes as 18-inch shells straddled the American formation. The air filled with the hollow thunder of naval gunfire, the concussion rolling across miles of sea. For the men on Johnston, the war had suddenly become personal, measured in seconds and bearing lines. Evans did not wait for higher command. At 700, he ordered flank speed and turned his destroyer toward the enemy. Johnston's turbines roared to life, spray whipping across the bow as she accelerated to over 30 knots. Her course was a direct charge into the heart of the Japanese fleet. It was an act so audacious that even fellow American crews watching from the carrier decks thought it a mistake at first. But as Johnston vanished into smoke and rain squalls, the pattern of the battle began to change. One small ship was buying time for an entire task group. Behind her, the carriers began to launch every plane they could. Pilots took off armed with depth charges, machine gun ammunition, anything available. The sea around them boiled with shell splashes and geysers of water. Above, the sky turned white with tracer fire. The battle off Samar had begun, not as an even contest of fleets, but as the desperate stand of a handful of American ships against overwhelming force. As Johnston closed the range, the contrast between the two forces was staggering. The Japanese center force advanced in a textbook battle line, their ships spreading out over 20 miles of sea, guns flashing in the dawn. The Yamato alone displaced 70,000 tons, Johnston barely reached 2,500, yet the destroyer's wake cut straight toward that wall of steel. Commander Evans stood exposed on the bridge wing, shouting orders through the roar of the engines. His plan was simple: close fast, fire a full spread of torpedoes, and disrupt the enemy's firing rhythm before they could zero in on the carriers. The odds didn't matter, time did. At 7:10, the ship's 5-inch guns opened fire at extreme range, their shells tracing faint white arcs across the gray horizon. The gunners picked a target, a heavy cruiser later identified as Kumano. Johnston's fire control radar tracked her course, correcting each salvo. Within minutes, several hits were observed near the cruiser's bow, bursts of black smoke confirming impact, but the Japanese reply came swiftly. Giant columns of water surrounded Johnston, shells landing close enough to drench the deck with spray. Each detonation felt like a hammer blow beneath the hull. The air smelled of cordite and burning paint. Evans gave the order to launch torpedoes. 10 warheads slid from their tubes in 2 quick salvos, leaving trails of white foam stretching toward the enemy. Moments later, a plume of fire and smoke erupted from Kumano's bow. The explosion tore away her forward section and forced her out of line. Johnston had drawn first blood, but her victory came at a price. Fragments from a near miss raked her deck, shattering radar equipment and killing men at the forward guns. The ship slowed briefly as crewmen scrambled to repair damage. Through the chaos, Evans made a crucial tactical decision: lay down a smoke screen between the enemy and the escort carriers. The destroyer weaved at full throttle, generators straining to pump thick gray smoke across the sea. It was an old trick from destroyer doctrine: visibility was survival. Behind the screen, the American carriers turned away to the southeast, launching aircraft that could harass the Japanese force. Johnston was now the nearest visible target, drawing fire meant for ships far more valuable. By 7:25, 2 other destroyers, Hull and Heermann, joined the counterattack. Together, they turned the battlefield into confusion. Japanese gunners reported multiple torpedo salvos and overlapping smoke plumes. Commanders hesitated, believing they faced an entire destroyer squadron instead of three. That pause saved precious minutes. Within that narrow window, American aircraft began diving on the enemy cruisers, dropping improvised bombs and strafing decks. The ocean turned to steam and chaos. On the bridge of Johnston, a petty officer reported fuel lines hit and aft guns offline, but Evans waved him off. "Keep firing," he ordered calmly. The destroyer's bow gun barked again and again, each salvo aimed at the nearest silhouette through smoke and flame. Johnston was no longer shielding others, it was leading them. The sea around Johnston was now a furnace. Shells from battleships and cruisers erupted in towering columns, geysers of water drenching the decks. At 7:35, a direct hit struck near the destroyer's forward turret, killing several crewmen instantly. Shrapnel ripped through the bridge, cutting communications and wounding Evans in the face and hands. Blood streaked his uniform, but he refused medical attention, staying upright as the ship heeled under the force of nearby blasts. Damage control reported flooding in the engineering spaces, and speed dropped briefly to 17 knots before the crew rerouted steam pressure and restored partial power. Against any normal standard, Johnston should have broken off. But turning away was not in Evans's vocabulary. Instead, he turned the wounded destroyer back toward the Japanese line. Through the smoke and confusion, new silhouettes appeared, heavy cruisers Chikuma and Chokai closing the distance to within 9,000 yards. Johnston's remaining guns opened up, firing at maximum elevation, every shell a gesture of defiance. The ship's fire control crew worked manually now, the director systems destroyed, their hands blistered from the heat of the traversing wheels. Hits were observed on Chikuma's bridge and after turrets, forcing her to break off momentarily. Incredibly, Johnston's gunners cheered between salvos. From the east, aircraft from the carriers Gambier Bay and Kalinin Bay streaked low over the waves, attacking the same cruisers with bombs and machine guns. Together, the air and sea assault began to throw the Japanese formation into disarray, but the enemy's firepower was still overwhelming. Battleship Congo's shells thundered overhead, one near mislifting Johnston's stern clear out of the water. Electrical power failed on the aft guns, forcing sailors to pass ammunition by hand through smoke-filled compartments. Heat and fumes made breathing almost impossible. Men tied wet cloths over their mouths and kept loading. Despite everything, Evans managed to reposition Johnston between the enemy and the fleeing carriers once more. The ship was a moving shield, drawing attention away from the slow escort carriers struggling to escape southward. Over the intercom, gun captains reported dwindling ammunition, fewer than 40 rounds left per gun. Yet the destroyer's fire continued, steady and disciplined, even as shells from the Japanese line tore through her superstructure. The ocean around her churned with debris and oil. By 8:10, Johnston was nearly dead in the water, her engines losing steam pressure, yet her guns still answered every flash from the enemy side. Other U.S. destroyers circled nearby, launching torpedoes before vanishing again behind their smoke. To the Japanese, it appeared as though an entire American task force had turned to fight. Confusion spread among their ranks. Some captains hesitated to pursue, others shifted fire to phantom targets. Amid that chaos, the escort carriers found a gap and began retreating toward Leyte Gulf. The tiny destroyer's sacrifice had bought them survival. As Johnston drifted through the haze, her hull blackened and listing, the crew kept their stations. No one spoke of surrender or retreat. The men were fighting not for victory, but for time and for each other. The morning sun rose higher through the haze, illuminating a sea littered with oil slicks, lifeboats, and drifting wreckage. Johnston's smoke pouring from her funnels, guns still firing sporadically, was barely afloat. Every compartment below deck was flooded or burning. Communications were reduced to runners shouting along passageways. Yet through this chaos, Commander Evans still paced the bridge, his voice steady and deliberate, giving the same clipped commands as when the day began. His destroyer was dying, but his control never faltered. At 8:20, Johnston engaged a formation of Japanese destroyers attempting to close in on the retreating carriers. She fired her last torpedoes at Congo, the massive battleship whose guns had dominated the battle for hours. Though the torpedoes missed, the attack forced the enemy ships to scatter, again buying time. Johnston's forward guns, down to a handful of shells, turned on the nearest cruiser, Chokai, hitting her superstructure and igniting secondary fires. The destroyer's gun crews operated in smoke so thick they could barely see each other. Several men collapsed from exhaustion and heat, replaced instantly by others stepping over them to continue loading. When ammunition finally ran out, the crew switched to armor-piercing practice rounds and star shells, anything that could still be fired. Each projectile arced into the gray distance like a final statement. Then came the inevitable. Around 9:20, enemy shells found their mark amidships. One burst in the engine room, killing nearly everyone inside and severing the power lines. Johnston shuddered, her speed dropping to a crawl. Flames reached the bridge and thick smoke rolled over the forward deck. The order to abandon ship was given at 9:45, but only after Evans confirmed the carriers had cleared the area. Survivors recalled his final actions vividly. Wounded and barely able to stand, he moved along the deck helping injured sailors into the water. Witnesses from nearby ships later saw Johnston still afloat, firing a single operational gun at a Japanese cruiser less than 3,000 yards away. At 10:10, another salvo struck her directly beneath the bridge, blowing out the hull. The destroyer began to roll to port, her bow rising high before sliding under. The sea swallowed her stern last, her American flag still fluttering. Out of 327 crewmen, only 141 were later rescued. Commander Evans was not among them. As the survivors drifted amid oil and debris, they watched the Japanese fleet begin to withdraw. The audacity of the American defense had convinced Vice Admiral Kurita that he faced a much larger force. Rather than risk his remaining ships, he ordered a retreat to the north. Johnston and her companions, 3 destroyers and 4 escorts, had achieved the impossible. Against battleships and cruisers many times their size, they had turned back an entire fleet. For the men in the water, the noise of battle faded, replaced by the hiss of waves and the crackle of fires burning on the surface. The destroyer that had refused to turn back was gone, but the carriers it protected were safe. By late morning, the ocean was eerily calm again. Smoke drifted in long gray ribbons across the horizon as rescue operations began. American destroyer escorts like Samuel B. Roberts and Dennis circled the debris fields, hauling survivors from the oil-slicked water. Many had been adrift for hours, clinging to life rafts under the tropical sun, surrounded by the wreckage of the fleet's smallest ships. Some had broken bones or burns, others drifted silently, too weak to speak. Out of Johnston's crew of more than 300, fewer than half were found alive. The rest disappeared into the Pacific, their names later carved into brass plaques at memorials that would stretch from Washington state to Leyte. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commander of Taffy 3, sent a brief signal after the enemy's withdrawal, the greatest fighting spirit I have ever seen. His battered task group had endured hours of bombardment from ships that should have annihilated them in minutes. Yet through smoke, confusion, and sheer courage, they had inflicted disproportionate damage. 3 Japanese heavy cruisers were sunk, 3 others crippled, and the entire center force forced to retreat. What history would later call the battle off Samar had become the most improbable victory in naval warfare, a triumph of determination over firepower. For the Japanese, the engagement revealed the limits of their naval doctrine. Admiral Kurita's decision to withdraw was partly tactical, partly psychological. Reports from his bridge officers described phantom aircraft carriers and exaggerated torpedo attacks, evidence of how the ferocity of Johnston and her sister ships had distorted perception. Kurita himself admitted years later that he believed he was facing a major American carrier force rather than a small escort group. By the time he realized the truth, his momentum was gone, and the opportunity to strike at the Leyte invasion fleet was lost forever. When survivors of Johnston were finally landed at Samar days later, they were greeted as heroes, though most were too exhausted to notice. Commander Evans was declared missing in action and later awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty." It was a formal acknowledgement of what every man who served under him already knew, that he had led not from safety, but from the front until his ship could fight no more. In the months that followed, U.S. intelligence pieced together the battle's outcome from captured Japanese logs and air reconnaissance. The realization spread through the Navy. A handful of destroyers and escort carriers had turned back a fleet that included the most powerful battleship ever built. Naval cadets would study the engagement for decades as an example of initiative, courage, and leadership under impossible odds. For the men who survived, it was simpler. They spoke of loyalty to their ship, their captain, and the unspoken promise that no one would turn back while another could still fight. In the decades after the war, the name USS Johnston faded quietly into naval history, remembered mostly by veterans who had witnessed her last fight. Yet among those who had survived Samar, the memory never dulled. They spoke of her not as a ship, but as a living thing, steel animated by willpower. At reunions and ceremonies, they recalled the feel of her deck shuddering under recoil, the smell of hot oil and gunpowder, and the calm authority of Commander Ernest Evans, the man who had never once considered retreat. For them, Johnston was proof that courage was not measured in tonnage or gun caliber, but in resolve. Historians later called the battle off Samar the last stand of the tin cans, a phrase born from affection and awe. The destroyers and escorts of Taffy 3 were, by every measure, outmatched, yet their ferocity upended assumptions about what light ships could do against capital vessels. In naval academies, the engagement became a study in initiative, how decisive action by small units could paralyze a superior enemy. Admiral Sprague's after-action report emphasized a truth that echoed across generations. No finer example of gallantry in naval history can be found. For decades, the ocean kept its silence about Johnston's resting place. Then in 2019, a deep-sea expedition led by explorers working with the U.S. Navy located wreckage more than 20,000 feet beneath the surface, near the original coordinates of the battle. Sonar images confirmed the unmistakable outline of a Fletcher-class destroyer, bow guns still trained forward. 2 years later, remotely operated cameras descended again, capturing clear footage of the ship lying upright on the seabed, her hull scarred but intact, the number 557 still visible through layers of silt. It was the deepest shipwreck ever surveyed. The footage spread quickly, not for spectacle, but for reverence. The ocean had kept her safe. For many who watched, the discovery was more than archaeology, it was closure. The names engraved on memorials now had a resting place, a tangible link between history and the present. The video of Johnston resting in eternal darkness carried no sound, only the slow drift of particles and the faint shimmer of light from the submersible. Yet even in silence, the ship seemed to speak, of defiance, of duty, of men who had refused to turn back. Today, the story of USS Johnston endures as one of the most extraordinary acts of valor in American naval history. In a world defined by overwhelming odds, she remains a symbol of what ordinary men can achieve when conviction overrules fear. Every time a destroyer's crew stands to general quarters, somewhere deep in the Pacific lies the spirit of a ship that once charged an entire fleet and never wavered.